So you're the heads of China, once one of the greatest empires in the world. But in the late 1800s and early 1900s, you hit a rough patch. China was defeated and pillaged by the British, the French, Japan, Russia. Basically, China, an empire that very much values honor, respect, was put to shame on the world stage for over 100 years. It was so bad that China would later call it the century of humiliation. If that wasn't bad enough, China also had a few more rough patches after that, with around 18 to 45 million deaths during a movement they called the Great Leap Forward, and around another 20 million deaths during the movement after that called the Cultural Revolution. Because of all the shame and disgrace, you've grown to resent not just the West, but the rest of the East, the North, the South, and everyone in between. You long for the days when you were number one, when you were on top of the world. But don't take my word for it, take the word from all these Chinese officials that regularly spout this.
China has become a global leader in terms of composite national strength and international influence.
And the worst part is that you could easily be number one if it wasn't for those meddling Americans that believe in democracy, natural rights, and other dangerous ideas like freedom of speech. Ideas that if your populace gets a whiff of, it would be the end of your rule. Because of these ideas and the fact that America is the only one standing in your way for world domination, this automatically makes them public enemy number one. Throughout human history, all the way up to the 1900s, to defeat an enemy state, you simply go to war. But as we've seen with our 100 years of shame, traditional warfare hasn't been our strong suit for a while, but it is for those despicable Americans. Even though the Americans didn't really win in the Middle East or Vietnam or Korea, their traditional forces of soldiers, tanks, and aircraft are a force to be reckoned with while having actual combat experience. So you put your pride away and objectively realize that it's far from guaranteed that you could win a head-to-head boots-on-the-ground war with the US. We need a new plan of attack, a new way to wage war where we don't have to go headfirst into America's greatest strength and our greatest weakness. Following our great Sun Tzu's Art of War, if you're gonna attack your enemy, attack him where he can't defend. Luckily for you, times have changed. The modern day battlefield is no longer fought with bullets, but with ones and zeros, dollars and cents. Sure, there'll always be a time for conventional warfare, but today, instead of storming the desert, it's storming the enemy's wallets by attracting foreign investors' money and not letting that money ever leave your country. Instead of killing soldiers, it's by baiting companies to outsource their workers for dirt cheap labor, thereby taking away jobs from the enemy country, killing their morale and making them more dependent on you. Instead of fighting on the European front or the Pacific front, it's fighting on the economic front, the social front. Instead of deploying troops, it's deploying cyber warfare troops that sit behind a computer screen. Instead of invading and occupying smaller nations, it's offering them irresistible loans to build infrastructure projects and taking them over once they can't pay it back. War is no longer using force to compel your enemy to your will, but rather by using all means, armed and unarmed force, lethal and non-lethal force, by doing whatever it takes. And you want to know what the best part is? It's that while all these revolutionary changes are happening to the battlefield, your arch nemesis, the US, are still spending away all their resources building up their conventional forces, thinking that they have the most powerful military, leaving them with no resources or desire to invest into the real domains, the cyber and economic ones. But can you really blame them? Their traditional military-industrial complex and defense contracts make a lot of money. So lucky for us, why would they want to change? That's not our job, the US military leaders say. So like everything else their government does, they keep kicking the can down the road. Like Sun Tzu said, if your opponent doesn't even know they're at war, well, they've already lost. This is that strategy.
We're at war. Only it's not being fought by guns and missiles, not yet at least. It's a war of perception.
The greatest long-term threat to our nation's information and intellectual property and to our economic vitality is the counterintelligence and economic espionage threat from China.
But I think it's the most consequential, existential threat, not just to America, just to democracy the world's ever seen.
But if you think these issues are just an intelligence issue or a government problem or a nuisance largely just for big corporations who can largely take care of themselves, you could not be more wrong. It's the people of the United States who are the victims of what amounts to Chinese theft on a scale so massive that it represents one of the largest transfers of wealth in human history.
War, combat, it's all about deception. You make the enemy think you're gonna come out from one corner to shoot, but then boom, you come out of the other corner and blow them to bits. The modern battlefield is no different. You make the West believe that you support free trade and globalization while systematically taking advantage of it. You tell other countries like the US to say no to protectionism, to tariffs. Well, that's literally your entire strategy. You wave the carrot of short-term profits in front of your enemies that are drooling at the mouth while using their money to fund your rise to number one.
China has a fundamentally different system than ours, and it's doing all it can to exploit the openness of ours while taking advantage of its own closed system.
And at the core, China's main strategy and advantage over the US is just that. The ability to think in decades and centuries instead of quarterly earnings reports or the next election cycle. China has a vision, a big why, a purpose to guide them through all the short-term pain in their journey to world domination with absolute power over their subjects to back it up. The US, on the other hand, have grown weak and comfortable from nearly 100 years of opulence. And much like how a spoiled child can never work hard, America's prosperity and freedom will be its own downfall. They're not willing to give up their comforts to fight a bigger enemy, and their government has hardly any control over their own citizens. Think of China kinda like the old robber barons like Rockefeller or JP Morgan, but at a global level. We can use every single dirty trick in the book to crush our competitors.
The Chinese government is engaged in a broad, diverse campaign of theft and malign influence, and it can execute that campaign with authoritarian efficiency. They're calculating, they're persistent, they're patient, and they're not subject to the righteous constraints of an open democratic society or the rule of law.
Every war has different fronts that must be fought. In World War II, it was the European front and the Asia-Pacific front. For this new Cold War, there are many different fronts, with one of the most important being the economic front. China saw how money turned the US into a global superpower and how micromanaging everything destroyed the Soviet Union. So China took the best of both worlds. They combined the absolute authoritarianism they need to stay in power, but sprinkled on some capitalism to make the money they would need to dominate the world. Or in other words, we realized that money talks on the global stage, so we align private profit with national interests. China has complete control over the economy, so we can do whatever it takes to make sure the right companies succeed in the direction we want. And yet we've created one of the freest environments to do business. There's no pesky things like the EPA, Better Business Bureau, intellectual property rights, and yet the government has the final say on all matters. If they think your company is better suited to merge with this other company, they'll take your company and assets by force and merge it with the other.
An awful lot of large Chinese businesses are state-owned enterprises, literally owned by the government and thus the party. But even if they aren't, China's laws allow its government to compel any Chinese company to provide any information it requests, including American citizens' data. On top of that, Chinese companies of any real size are legally required to have Communist Party cells inside them to keep them in line.
The equivalent to the US government forcing Apple to have a US representative on their board of directors to make sure everything is going according to plan. Competition among Chinese is extremely dog-eat-dog, and yet important companies get cash injections and are backed by the government. Because of this closed economy, we're able to pull off some very clever tricks that get us ever so closer to world domination. One of our greatest tactics is the fact that when foreign investors put money into our country, no matter how much money they earn on paper, they can never pull it out of the country. Here's how it works. Number 1, we attract foreign businesses, investors, banks, hedge funds, many of them from the US, to invest billions upon billions of dollars over the years into Chinese real estate, businesses, stocks, which is not very hard given that we have the biggest population and the biggest new market to make money in. Number 2, the investors' money is used to make our economy the fastest growing in history, while preventing that same money from being used to grow America's economy. Number 3, the investors see their money grow on paper, which makes them really happy and attracts more investors. And number 4, when investors want to take their earnings out and convert it into, let's say, USD, they can't. Why? Because this is our closed economy. You have to follow our rules if you want to play. And our rule is that we need this money to stay within our borders to keep funding our astronomical growth. As long as more money keeps coming into China and less is going out, all is going according to plan. Sure, with the right person applying the right pressure, money can go out of China, but for the average foreign firm like Chevron, Sony, Exxon, these suckers have had their money trapped here since 2015. Now if you're sitting there with your hand stroking your chin, wondering, this kinda sounds like a Ponzi scheme? Where investors put money in and their money is used as returns for the investor that came in before them? No! Well, I'll let you guys be the judge of that. And if you think that trick was clever, you have seen nothing yet. See, every country's currency's value is determined by traders on foreign exchange markets. But who says that's how it has to work? If we put our yuan on the market, we'd completely lose control over it. So the yuan isn't traded on foreign exchange markets. Everything happens within our borders. Its value is whatever we say it is.
China's printed $30 trillion worth of RMB in a decade. Like, the scale to which they've printed is, again, it's unprecedented. Can the Chinese run their stock market up? Absolutely. Domestically, they control the price, they control the printing press, they control the police, they control the narrative.
And there are many other tricks up our sleeves. Forcing foreign companies to give up their trade secrets to do business in China when no other nations do that to Chinese firms. Stealing anywhere from $2 to $3 trillion worth of intellectual property from the US over the past 10 years and selling it back to them at a discount.
They all estimate that number is $200 to $300 billion worth of IP per year. There's a return on that annually as well. So over the last decade, they've stolen, 2 to 3 trillion in IP from us.
We've now reached the point where the FBI is opening a new China-related counterintelligence case about every 10 hours. Of the nearly 5,000 active FBI counterintelligence cases currently underway across the country, almost half are all related to China.
Not allowing Western social platforms like Google, Facebook, YouTube in our economy so we can control the narrative, while the West allows all of our government-controlled social platforms into their nations so we can influence their narrative. Getting US companies to outsource 3.7 million manufacturing jobs to our very poor, cheap laborers since 2001, pummeling their middle class even more. Forcing US companies not to spread ideas we don't like Disney, Hollywood, the NBA, Marriott, and more. All this economic warfare is for one purpose: to fund our meteoric rise as the fastest growing economy in history with everyone else's money, while fooling everyone into thinking that we're playing by the rules and that yes, you should definitely keep treating us fairly even though we're not treating you fairly. And all this economic power allows us to move on to the other fronts of this new Cold War, like the all too insidious infrastructure front. Infrastructure is one of the most important aspects of a society. It is literally the underlying foundation of a country. Infrastructure also happens to be one of those things that is taken for granted by the populace. People in the US typically don't go about their days wondering, hey, how secure are gas pipelines or electricity grids? Or who controls the shipping ports and container ships where 90% of our goods travel on? Yet if just one of these systems went out, it would lead to some catastrophic events. That's why in China, we understand just how important infrastructure warfare is in our ever more connected world. That's why we have a laser focus on infrastructure both domestically and internationally. Within China, we're focused on making our economy completely independent from the outside world, where we're not dependent on exports or imports. An economy that isn't fragile to the goodwill of others like how every nation, including China, is right now. This is where ghost cities come into play. To create this insulated economy, China started building entire cities, 120 in total, each designed to hold between 5 to 10 million people. That's why in just 2 years from 2012 to 2014, China poured more concrete than the US did in the last 100 years. Because these cities were built ahead of demand, there are 50 ghost cities in China. 50 cities ranging from twice the size of Philadelphia to the size of New York without a soul to be seen. And guess what? China's plan for an independent super economy was funded by, you guessed it, the West, headed by Wall Street, who probably aren't going to get their money back. And every cent of this construction went straight into China's record-breaking GDP numbers. So that begs the question, if there are 64 million vacant apartments on the market and even more vacant business space in the billions of square feet, it would only make sense that real estate prices should have already crashed in China, right? Well, no. As we learn in the economic front, China controls the entire economy, including real estate and prices. So we simply prevent this new real estate from being sold. See, what Westerners don't understand is that economic growth is very easy if you control everything. While we're making our infrastructure more robust at home, naturally we're focused on making everyone else's infrastructure more fragile abroad. This is where the Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, comes in. A plan to connect nearly 70 nations, many of them poor, desperate, emerging nations around the world, by road, rail, air, and most importantly by sea. And here's how it works. Number 1, find nations with resources we need, whether that be cheap labor, mines, or important locations. Number 2, approach these desperate nations with a smile and say that in the name of facilitating free trade and harmony, peace, and prosperity, we'll give you a loan that we know you can't pay back to build infrastructure projects like a seaport to build up your economy, and we'll just collect interest in return, a no-brainer deal. You'd be crazy to pass it up. And then boom, step number 3. Once you drown the country in debt, it's basically yours. And from here, you can do whatever you want. In the case of the very strategic port of Sri Lanka, when they couldn't make the payments, they just gave it back to China with even more land on top of that. In the case of Africa, you can keep milking the resources and cementing your influence and control. As these nations start to prosper, you can sell to them, collect their data, and further your influence. And all these locations that are practically ours are more avenues for us to send conventional military troops through if that time ever comes. More on that later. If you want to learn more about this modern day colonialism, check out our video called The Profitable Business of Enslaving Third World Countries. Along with domestic infrastructure and the BRI, the last and most important piece of the infrastructure front is 5G. Now, if you're looking for 5G conspiracy theories, go watch some other video because we don't even have to go into that kind of speculation. 5G is not just another phone network. Sure, it gives consumers up to 100 times faster speed, but for the most part, consumers won't be able to take advantage of all that extra juice. The real game changer is that this extra speed and bandwidth will make way for a new generation of society built around devices connected to each other. Whereas 4G only allows around 6,500 devices per square mile, 5G can support up to 1 million devices per square mile. This extra capacity means that every aspect of a society's infrastructure, planes, trains, machinery, self-driving cars, smart homes, connected healthcare, agriculture, cameras, the military, will be able to communicate with each other over a 5G network. More data being collected means that more data can be funneled into AI and machine learning algorithms at an even faster rate. And if you thought technology was already moving fast, if the highway data travels on gets supercharged, the pace of technology will increase at an even more incomprehensible rate. We already talked about how fragile nations are to the infrastructure. So if the future of infrastructure is powered over 5G networks, if one were to control said 5G networks, one could theoretically have the keys not to just the kingdom, but to the entire modern world, including all of one's enemies.
In our modern world, there is perhaps no more ominous prospect than a hostile foreign government's ability to compromise our country's infrastructures and devices.
If one controlled all 5G networks, one could theoretically view all the world's data traveling on those superhighways, including business plans, military plans, academic papers, engineering plans, surveillance camera feeds, anything and everything sent over 5G. One could also turn off aspects of a nation's infrastructure at will. One could collect and feed everyone's data into one's own AI algorithms like one is already doing with the government-controlled social media platforms. Or in other words, if China is gonna get back to its glory days on the world stage, it would be very advantageous of us to take the same approach we're doing with the Belt and Road Initiative. Generously offer to build the 5G networks for other nations, out of our own goodwill of course. But you gotta keep this part extra secret because other countries are starting to catch on to our intentions, like Japan, Australia, the UK, India, those meddling Americans of course, and maybe even the EU if we don't act fast.
If Chinese companies like Huawei are given unfettered access to our telecommunications infrastructure, they could collect any of your information that traverses their devices or networks. Worse still, they'd have no choice but to hand it over to the Chinese government if asked. The privacy and due process protections that are sacrosanct in the United States are simply non-existent in China.
There are many other fronts in this new Cold War that we don't have time to get into. The cyber warfare front, the technology front, the social front, but there's one more front worth mentioning, an under-the-radar return to the conventional military front. As we mentioned in the beginning of this video, as long as we're not guaranteed to win a conventional war with the US, we'll keep fighting on the more subtle modern-day battlefield. But China isn't dumb. We know that conventional warfare will never go away and that someday, we might just have to participate in it. And as the West has been funding our rise, we've been investing a lot of that money not just in normal infrastructure like we already talked about, but also into our military. So if or when that time ever comes, we can strike. China already has more warships than the US Navy. While the US has been lowering its ICBM count due to international agreements, we've been stockpiling ours and regularly show them off. And a healthy amount of US military components and raw materials come straight from China. The propellant that fires their missiles, materials for their night vision goggles, their entire telecom system, their computers, they're entirely dependent on us. So for now, we'll just keep selling war materials to the Americans, build up our own power and control, and then strike if the time comes. So you know that war is all about deception, not just conventional fighting. You know about our economic front, the business front, all the different infrastructure fronts at home and abroad, and how we're gearing up our conventional fronts. So the question remains, who's gonna win this new Cold War? Well, if the West keeps fighting each other about systematic racism while the concept of racial discrimination doesn't even exist in China, with its very own concentration camps and cattle cars, mind you. If the West keeps calling a certain president a tyrant when there's an actual authoritarian regime a few thousand miles off the coast of California that makes this certain president look like Gandhi, if consumers keep buying Chinese plastic just to save a buck, well, they better start learning Mandarin.
And let's just calm down and put this. Okay.
Confronting this threat effectively does not mean we shouldn't do business with the Chinese. It does not mean we shouldn't host Chinese visitors. It does not mean we shouldn't welcome Chinese students or coexist with China on the world stage. But it does mean that when China violates our criminal laws and international norms, we are not going to tolerate it, much less enable it. The FBI and our partners throughout the US government will hold China accountable and protect our nation's innovation, ideas, and way of life with the help and vigilance of the American people. Thank you for having me here today.
Speaking of learning Mandarin, check out today's video sponsor. I mean, we don't have a sponsor because not many brands are willing to support this video. Economic warfare at its finest. So I tell you what, if you want to support this channel financially and you want more videos like this one, check out a course I made on how to land a remote job. This is how I got my start in this whole make money online thing with a $40 per hour remote web dev job, and I believe it's the most practical way for others to get started as well. You don't have to start a business from scratch. You learn valuable skills on your own time while making consistent money so you're not starving to death. And as we've seen in recent times, remote jobs are a lot less fragile than traditional ones. And my favorite part is that you can use remote jobs as a jumping off point for whatever you want. You can use the extra time to work on a side business like I did, or you can be a digital nomad traveling the world, which a lot of people do with their remote jobs as well. And with this course, it walks you through what jobs to go after based on your personality, what the best route to learn it are, standing out when applying to jobs and interviews, and basically everything you need from start to finish. And you can start your remote journey right now for a very reasonable price and support this channel at the same time with the link below. Gentle reminder that I have partnered up with the Chinese Communist Party, and for every single time you guys watch a video, leave a comment, leave a like, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, your social credit score will go up by 1 point. So get that social credit score up before you get thrown into a concentration camp, I mean a re-education camp.
Nobody here is a criminal. No, sir. Okay, gentlemen, sorry we couldn't work anything out, but I'm gonna go home and pay my taxes.
Highly recommend you guys read the book that this video is based on called Stealth War: How China Took Over While America's Elite Slept by Brigadier General Robert Spalding. From what I understand, Brigadier General is like one of the highest ranks in the military, so this guy, he knows what he's talking about. It's not that long or a hard read, and it goes over like a ton of stuff that I didn't have time to cover in this video. Also, I see you guys backing me up in the war zone that is the comment section. This is turning out to be like a real mafia where you like defend the Godfather, so you know, Don Tran really appreciates it, and I want you to know I see you and I really appreciate you. Alright, you can follow me on Instagram at jaketran.io for like behind the scenes stuff, teasers, random memes, me ranting about stuff. It's pretty good over there. So join us over at Instagram at jaketran.io. Thank you so much for watching. You've been awesome. I've been Jake. Stay dangerous. I'll see you guys in the next one.